Hey y'all, welcome back to the Theology Mill from Stock Publishers. I'm Zach Mickle, and today I am talking with Jacob Marques-Rollison about a Cascade companion book on Jacques Ellul that he co-authored with Jacob Van Vliet. Marques-Rollison is currently the co-president of the International Jacques Ellul Society, and among his publications on the life and work of Jacques Ellul are a book called A New Reading of Jacques Ellul, Presence and Communication in the Postmodern World, as well as an English translation of Ellul's two-volume ethical treatise To Will and To Do, which is published through Cascade. Marques-Rollison and his wife are on staff at L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland. Before we hop over to the interview, I do want to say we are still running a sale for newsletter subscribers through the end of this month, so through the end of May 2025. So for anyone who rates the show on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, we will send them a free PDF of any Whip and Stock title. Just be sure to send some kind of proof to me at my email address, which is zmickle@whipandstock.com. So that's Z M as in Mary, ICKEL @whipandstock.com. And then I'll make sure to respond within a few days' time with your free PDF. You can also find all the details for that deal and for upcoming deals by simply subscribing to our Theology Mill newsletter. And the link for the subscription form is in the description below. And now let's hear from our guest. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Joined today by Dr. Jacob Marques-Rollison, co-author with Jacob Van Vliet of the Cascade Companion Jacques Ellul, a companion to his major works. So Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we kind of get into the book and talking about Ellul a bit, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about yourself, maybe what you do for work and how you became interested in Jacques Ellul.
Sure. Thanks, Zach, for having me. I'm from the U.S., in Pennsylvania, and I've kind of been wandering around Europe now for a long time, and have now been living and working at the L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland for about 3.5 years now. And it's a kind of Christian study center and community founded by Francis Schaeffer back in the 1950s, and it's still going. And in terms of research and writing, I'm pretty much almost exclusively focused on Jacques Ellul at the moment. It's been a little while that way, and it's not that I set out for it to be that way, but it's kind of the way things have gone, and I'm very happy with that. So,
Sure.
it's been a lot of Ellul these last few years.
Nice. That's awesome. There are like several L'Abri locations around the world, aren't there?
Yes, that's right. I think we've got 8 full branches running. And then there's 1 or 2 more projects that hope someday to be a full branch that are not quite as full time as the others. But yeah, they're scattered around Europe, North America, South America, and there's one in South Korea as well.
Okay, nice. Have you been to any of the other ones?
No, so my wife and I so far have only been to the Swiss one, but we certainly hope soon to visit some of the others as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's awesome. I've never been to any of them, but I have a friend who's visited a few. I think he went to one in North. They have one in Canada. Yeah, in
Yes, that's
is
right.
it in British Columbia?
Yep. Yeah, not far from Vancouver,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think he went to that one, and then he went to a couple of the ones in Europe, and he had really good things to say about. They're sort of like study houses where you also work and kind of live in community for kind of however long you need or want. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's more or less it. It combines. There's an intellectual component. We expect the students to come to spend about 3 hours a day studying, but that could be reading or listening to lectures or praying or journaling, things like that. And then there is certainly a communal life component. We live together, we eat together. So when you're not studying the other half of your day, as a student, you're generally doing some of the things that make the place run, like cooking, cleaning, gardening, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well let's before we get into Jacques Ellul, I have to ask you our kind of opener question that I start all of our podcast episodes with, which is if you could place any three people, dead or alive, and we'll assume that Jacques Ellul is already in the room, so you could do three in addition to him if you'd like, and you could kind of listen on their conversation. Which three people would you choose and why?
Mm. That's too difficult of a question. No. Yeah, so if Dracula's already in the room, I think I would like, it sounds kind of strange. I would love to have Frederick Chopin in the room. I love his music. I always have, and it would be cool to hear what's going on in his brain besides all that music. I would love to have the Czech reformer Jan Hus in the yeah, Middle Ages in the room. And then I think um, I would like to have the Apostle John in the room. I think those two would give me enough to think about for quite some time.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to open up with just it's a really general question. I know it's probably a hard one to answer, but just to kind of give folks something to grab a hold on if they've not heard of Ellul. So first question is just kind of who was Jacques Ellul? And maybe if you want to describe sort of what was kind of the basic nature of his work, what was he sort of up to in his writing?
Sure. So Jacques Ellul was a 20th century French um, Protestant sociologist and theological ethicist. I think that's the best one sentence way to put it. So
Nice.
he does live basically the whole 20th century. Born in 1912, lives in 1994, and so it's no surprise that technology and thinking around technology and all that's going along with it is a big part of his work. So you figure he's born when the Model T Ford is kind of new, and he dies with the launch of eBay in 1994. So he's seen a lot of pain, you could say. In fact, his life passes this century, which pretty much is nothing but constant technological change and innovation. So what he does is he writes something like 60 books. Well, at least there's about 60 published today. There's probably more coming out of unpublished manuscripts. And then over 1,200 articles throughout his life. And so that's a mountain of writing. And about half of it is more or less sociological. And then the other half is theological. Yeah, and the two sides of his work need to be read together, ideally, and they don't fit together like a let's say like a nice puzzle or something like that. Even though there are ways in which it works like a puzzle, um, they fit together. It's more like they're two sides of a magnetic pole, like held in tension with one another, and to hold them in tension, I think is the right way to do it. So yeah, basically French guy, professor at the University of Bordeaux for most of his career, studies the history of institutions, which is something like a combination of economics and sociology and law all combined. And he's into Roman law. He really likes ancient Rome, or at least as a student he does. And then he goes on to analyze a lot of things in our society. So yeah, if somebody's not heard of him, I guess that's the best way to describe him. He's an interesting, very creative thinker, interdisciplinary thinker. And his books range across all kinds of topics and disciplines. And I guess the last thing I would say, if somebody has never heard of him, to pique their interest is, I think the most compelling way to read him is as some kind of contemporary figure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like the sort of uh, the sort of job of like a sociologist, or like the job description of a sociologist looks a lot different in France, or maybe in Europe just more generally, than it does in North America. Like like it's, yeah, it seems like what we think of as the discipline of sociology in North America is something quite different from what sort of Jacques Ellul is doing on the sort of sociological side of his work. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you see significant differences sort of between kind of two different styles of sociology, or is it just something that's thought of, sort of a discipline that's thought of very differently or practiced very differently in France or in Europe?
Yeah, so without being, definitely a sociologist myself or anything, I would say that it's probably fair to say that today, if you study sociology, your education will be a lot more quantitative. You'll get tools of
Sure.
quantitative analysis where um, I think what Ellul was doing and those who inspired him is much more of a qualitative kind of analysis. There, the I think the simplest way to say it is that what really interests Jacques Ellul as a sociologist is the link between the individual and the group.
Mm.
And so he's asking what different kinds of links are there? What are the different qualities or characteristics of those different ways of connecting these two things? Is it a mass? Is it a society? Is it more correct to describe it as a system? All these are the kinds of thoughts that go into his thinking, and so that's why everything from economics to politics to basically, I think his definition of an institution is anything that like is collectively decided and agreed upon and set up. And something that broad has to be at play because all of those things affect the ways we relate to each other as groups and therefore with our individual lives as well. I guess I think that's just a good way to summarize it is that qualitative aspect. It,
Hmm.
in that respect, it is a tiny bit more philosophical, I suppose, than a more quantitative sociology that focuses a lot on statistics. Yeah, he doesn't do so much of that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. No, that's very helpful clarification. Thank you. So you mentioned the kind of the two sides of his writings, right? There's the theological on the one hand and the sociological on the other. And I know from having read your book that that's something that you and Jacob Van Vliet hit on a good bit in here as well, and even kind of structure the book according to these sort of two sides that, like you said, are held in tension more so than they're like a puzzle that fits neatly together. And yeah, I know you're not also the first to sort of describe things this way. So I guess, yeah, how another kind of broad and big question. So I'll let you run with it whatever direction you want to. But how would you kind of describe what Elul is up to on each of those sides of his work? And then you mentioned, right, that they're sort of held in tension. I wonder if you might say something more about kind of what you think the relationship is between these two, given sort of the specifics of what he's writing about.
So on the sociological side, and I'm gonna kind of answer in advance what I think is going to be another king point soon, is he's really inspired by Karl Marx. And I think, at least in North America, we hear Karl Marx sometimes, and on a popular level, we immediately think Russian communism or
Yeah.
something like that. And that's not fair, I think, or precise enough. And Ellul, I mean, in general, uh, in France, at least for most of the 20th century, to be a working intellectual, you had to have some kind of relation to Marxism, and it was seen as a very morally positive idea or system of ideas. So Ellul's approach to Marxism is totally nonviolent. He's not interested in what Lenin or Stalin do after. What he finds in Marx and like is a method of analysis, and what that method is he looks at history as this play of forces that are in tension with one another at any given moment. And so, in Ellul's reading of Marx, if Marx thinks if he can map out all these different forces, and then he can pinpoint which one is the dominant force at a given moment, then he'll be able to make good predictions about how society will evolve.
Mm.
And Ellul thinks that Marx did that really well. And he thinks Marx was right for 19th century, by pinpointing economics or capital as the driving force. And so Ellul thinks, okay, if he was right for his day, the trouble is now, mid 20th century, things have changed. It's a lot more complex. We need to redo Marx's work. We need to redo that analysis of trying to pinpoint the dominant force that's driving sociological evolution. And so for Ellul, and he does this with his friend Bernard Charbonneau, the two of them kind of reduce all these, they try to map out the forces that they think are at play in society, and they reduce them to the dominant ones, and they think the top two are the state and then this other thing called technique. And they decide to split up the work. So his friend Charbonneau, Bernard, takes the state, and a little kind of disappointed because he wanted to take the state, but instead he takes technique. And so what that does is it launches him on a lifelong project of analyzing all the different aspects of Western society as expressions of this thing called technique. And we'll talk more about technique in a bit if you're interested. But so that's what his sociology is doing. He's trying to say this is the kind of impersonal force that's driving many of the decisions in our group, in our way of relating as a society. And so there's a way in which that can appear that might sound like sociologically neutral or an objective kind of science. The trouble is, once you kind of take a personal approach to it, you can't just say, "Oh well, fine, we're just driven by this thing." His whole point is his work functions as a call to action or a call to awareness, with hope that humanity will act and human freedom will mean that determining factor doesn't totally
Mm-hmm.
drive and determine social evolution. And so, especially on the theological side, what he does is he kind of interrogates that sociological description he's given with with the Word of God. And on the theology side, this is where the prophetic, I think, is the best descriptor for the kind of work he's doing. He sees himself as addressing the reader. He's not just trying to give an expose of something that you can then think about. He wants you to leave
Mm-hmm.
kind of interrogated or to feel, called to act or questioned, or in other words, to read his work well, I think you need to come away with a feeling of, wow, how am I going to respond?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I guess you could say that freedom becomes one of the dominant things at stake here. So if technique and the state are really driving human history, he's saying, well, before God, you're called to live in freedom. So what are you going to do? What does that freedom look like? And so his theology is this massive project of theological ethics that um, tries to not just draw but detail the kind of implications of what it might mean to live free in this technological society. And so it's not just freedom, but freedom is certainly one of the dominant things that he focuses on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a wonderful overview of his work. So you mentioned Marx. I'm also interested because I know there were some important influences that you mentioned in the book, sort of on influences on his thinking. I'm interested if you might say something about kind of who were some of those significant influences, whether that's on kind of the theological side or on the sociological side, and then maybe a little bit about kind of specifically how those influences sort of shaped or impacted sort of the shape of his work.
Sure. So yeah, I've done that a bit for Karl Marx and done what I think he takes from him the most, and what I think he didn't take from him as well. And I have to say really quick before I move on to the theological ones that Karl Marx was famously a complete atheist. Um,
Mm.
and he says something like atheism is the doorway into my thought. And Ellul, obviously, that's a bit of a contradiction for a Christian, somebody who at some point is converted. So Ellul grows up without a religious faith or religious background in his family, and around 18 years of old, 18 years of age, he's converted in a way that he once described as brutal, though he very rarely talks about it at all. And so this conversion means that his what he finds so compelling in Marx is something of a contradiction for him, and the contradiction never fully goes away. He wrestles with it all his life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, having said that, on the theological side, his two biggest influences are Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and theologian, and then the Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth. And of these three big influences, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Barth, over time, it becomes clear that the dominant voice is that of Kierkegaard. So there's one place where Ellul says something like, "I've never been an unconditional Barthian, but when Kierkegaard speaks, I only listen." And so so what does Ellul take from Kierkegaard? I'll go with Barth quicker. I think he says once that Barth gives him a way to do theology. He reads the dogmatics and he loves it. He loves, especially early on, he loves the early readings of Barth, the Word of God and the Word of Man. He describes Barth as unblocking an impasse in the church, between a sort of liberal theology and a conservative theology that uh, you know alienate one another or don't want to listen to each other or don't want to take each other seriously. Bart finds a way to take both and say, all right, well, we're going forward anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And Ellul loves that movement of unblocking that kind of deadlock. And he also says something like, before reading Bart, he had read quite a lot of Calvin. And then he said that while he was attracted by Calvin's rigorous legal style of reasoning, Bart, it was more like Bart launched him on an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets a lot of these things from Bart. He gets a way to do theology from Bart. From Kierkegaard, what he gets, I think, is that prophetic kind of communication that he then seeks to imitate, not only in his style of writing, but in the construction of his two-part work. So many people famously talk about Kierkegaard's stages of aesthetic, and then he wants to move his readers from an aesthetic way of thinking to an ethical, to a religious, and then to, in a sense, or at least in Ellul's reading, to leave his readers alone before God, put them in the presence of God, and then just step out and leave them there. And so I think Ellul gets that, he feels that communicative force of Kierkegaard's work. He feels interrogated by it. He also gets one phrase that comes up a lot in his work is, it's as if Kierkegaard puts his back against the wall and confronts him with this stuff in a way that nothing else does. So that kind of prophetic piece of communication Ellul gets from Kierkegaard, but then in terms of the structuring of Ellul's work, so Kierkegaard once said that to understand any of his work properly, you have to read all of it, which is an absurd demand when you write so much. But Ellul's work functions the same way, and I still haven't read all of it, and I don't know if I ever will. But there is a whole lot. Like I said, about 60 books, almost 1,300 articles, and that's just the stuff that's already published. In Ellul's work, that's what I mean when I say there is a way in which his work functions like a puzzle. So if you haven't read enough of it, you don't have enough of the pieces to get a decent image of the whole. So you kind of misunderstand, like even though you obviously after reading one or two of Ellul's books, you understand more than you did before, you still don't have enough context to situate them well. And therefore you risk really misunderstanding them. Now, I think one way that functions is so Ellul once says towards the end of his life that if you only read his sociology, it would drive you to suicide because there's no
Mm.
hope in it.
Wow.
Um, and so if you want to have hope, you need to read the theological side, in which hope is perhaps the driving force. So,
Mm.
yeah, I guess that's just a little bit of how these three major influences weave together to create a pretty strange, or I guess unique anyway, a pretty unique body of writing. And I think tension really is the critical word. When you read his stuff, it doesn't leave you in this peaceful, serene
Yeah.
state. It it kind of riles you up, and it's as if he threw you in the middle of a war zone, but then he told you how to navigate it a bit. But then at the end of the day, you still have to navigate it yourself. To finish my response to this question, we once had a student here at L'Abri who told me one day he was reading C.S. Lewis, and then the next day he was reading Jacques Ellul, and he said the contrast was striking because it was as if Lewis, with these this medieval or classicist way of thinking, he constructs this beautiful world in harmony and writes
Hmm.
in a
Hmm.
very developed and polished literary style, whereas with Jacques Ellul, he felt like Ellul was chasing him and yelling at him.
That's
So there you
that's
go.
funny. Yeah. No, that's a great image. Yeah. So okay. So we have Karl Marx, Barth, Kierkegaard. With Marx and with Barth, right? Obviously, they're both dialectical thinkers in sort of significantly different ways. Would you describe Ellul as sort of a dialectical thinker? Like, is that something that he pulls from one or both of them in any ways?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's totally central to his way of thinking, and in fact, I think it becomes more central as time goes on. He has a late article called On Dialectics that he writes, I think, in the 80s, in which he basically says, yes, everything in my thought is dialectical. Um, and it, it's not without, you know, it causes difficulties, especially to those who are um, not used to thinking that way. He really does force you to think differently. Now, as one thing I think that plays in here is what dialectic means.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think for some thinkers, dialectic can refer to a sort of reasoning in which there are stages that might be more or less predetermined or known in advance, and therefore it names progression that's set up and then has to be followed through. For other thinkers, or in another use of the word, I think dialectic is something more like dialogue, in which it describes something in which there's multiple voices in tension that don't always get resolved into the same one. And so for me, I think Ellul's writing is better, or I find it more compelling, let's say, when dialectic means more like dialogue. But I think there are times where dialectic in his writing does feel more like, stages that you have to progress to. And that stuff I still find interesting, even if it compels me a bit less. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so he definitely is a dialectical thinker,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I mean when I say you have to hold these things in tension to have a sort of balanced view of his work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Okay. We'll start by looking at maybe a little bit of his theology, and then we can wrap up with talking about some of his more sociological work. So, first thing I want to talk about is one of his kind of major theological books, "Presence in the Modern World," which is the first chapter that you guys sort of cover
Mm-hmm.
in your book, right? Because your book's sort of
Mm-hmm.
structured with each chapter is sort of a look at one of Ellul's books. So, what this book, "Presence in the Modern World," though, what would you say is sort of the main thrust of that book? What's he doing there, kind of in a nutshell?
Sure. And actually, before I get into presence in the modern world, I'll just make a brief side note. So there's a way in which our book too is very dialectical. So I would describe it as it is a true collaboration. So Jacob Van Vliet and I, he was a total pleasure to work with. He's very generous and charitable colleague and thinker. He proposed including me on this project that he had already started. and I was delighted to jump in. And so we both, our voices are both in there, switching back and forth on each other, and I think that's all the more wonderful and all the more Ellulian in a certain way. Having said that, side note, so presence in the modern world. The reason we started with it, and the reason I think it's a crucial work, is he conceived it. He conceived of presence in the modern world as the introduction to everything that he would go on to write. And there's a lot of ways in which that is true. If you know many of his later books, later themes, you can find almost all of them in there somewhere, whether in one word, one sentence, one paragraph, or one chapter. And that, but the way you ask that, what's the main thrust here, is exactly right. And that was some of the thinking, or one of the main questions guiding my own doctoral research is, what does he mean by presence?
Hmm.
And so, in fact, there was an earlier translation of this book called Presence of the Kingdom, which I think was a shame because it makes the emphasis more on the kingdom. But in this title, Presence in the Modern World, it makes presence stick out a bit more. Like, what does he mean by presence? So, what does he mean by presence? I've mentioned that he sets up his intellectual, or at least sociological project with his dear friend Bernard Chardonnel. And both of them write a ton of stuff, and with slight variations that are not negligible, they matter. But still, both of them, you can describe their work as extended reflections on embodiment, on what it is to be this weird thing that is a human being, that has some kind of a spirit and body. And and so Ellul talks about incarnation quite a lot.
Hmm.
And so there's a sense in which what he is worried about in the 20th century is all the ways that what he and his friend Charbonneau are worried about in the 20th century, all the ways in which these various impersonal forces like the ink, the state, etc., alienate us from the bodies we live in, from the place and the time and the space we live in, and I guess create a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be human or to be a creature in this way. So present is, at minimum, it's a call to rediscover the meaning and value of time and place, and the time and place we live in, and to place a certain value on doing that bodily, on the sort of
Hmm.
human proportion of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's how I would describe something of what he means by presence, though he doesn't do that way in the book. In the book, he sets it up by talking about the chapters describe first the problem of what it is to be the Christian in the world, and here's where he sets up a sort of relationship between church and society that is one of tension. It's not integration in which church is this happy, functioning piece of society that has its place like everything else. It's more like the church, I guess, to adopt a biblical metaphor, the church is more of an embassy. It's
Hmm.
the presence of something foreign in somewhere that isn't that the home of that foreign place.
Sure.
And an embassy does have a certain function, but it's more about negotiating two things that aren't the same than it is about having them all combined into one big thing. So there's this irreducible tension between the Christian and the world in which they live, and Ellul seeks to play that tension up as much as he can. The second chapter describes revolutionary Christianity, or he describes Christianity as this kind of permanent revolution, this social force that it's a bit different from liberation theology in the sense that many times liberation theology seeks social change as a result of theology, whereas for Ellul, it's not. It's more like the social change is an inevitable side effect of
Mm-hmm.
Christian presence and Christian incarnation. And then, so he makes Christianity this sort of social force that keeps society from closing in on itself. And then he goes on to discuss the problem of the end and the means, in which he talks about how he thinks in today's world, the means have absorbed the ends, and there are no more ends, which is to say that society has become this kind of machine that develops blindly without anyone directing it. And so part of the human problem of this technological society for Ellul will be to find a way to assign new ends to the means that we've created. And then finally, he ends on a chapter about the problem of communication. And it's as if this foreshadows the way in which all the things that work in the 20th century make speech really difficult and just understanding one another. And I guess you could see this as a prefiguring the rise of advertising, the rise of a world of new media where you're bombarded by so many messages, so much information that you can't possibly take it all in one day. You could see this as a prefiguring of this modern philosophy that will come later in the century in France, and all the questions it raises about language and meaning. So yeah, basically all that to say, when I read Movements in the Modern World, it lays out a little project in a nutshell, all while being a very prophetic book that still today reads in a really striking way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure, sure. So yeah, kind of jumping ahead to the theological ethics project he writes, which is ends up being, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but five volumes. So this kind of multi-volume big project where he's trying to lay out sort of a theological ethics. Could you maybe just give us kind of a brief overview of that sort of
Sure.
larger project that he undertakes?
Yeah. So I think, this is, if Karl Barth sat down to read the church dogmatics and said, I'm going to write a big book and I'm not going to hold back. I think
Sure.
that's what Ellul did here with his theological ethics. So what he does is he plans it out in 4 different parts. And so volumes will count differently, but in terms of parts, first an introduction that would just set up the whole thing and answer some preliminary questions. And then for the other 3 parts, the 3 main parts, he wanted it to center around the trio of faith, hope, and love. He thinks that, the New Testament gives very good reason to do that, and he thinks most Christian theologians throughout the last 2,000 years have done that, have in some way centered the Christian life around these descriptors of faith, hope, and love. They've often been treated as virtues, a little the virtue language in the background. It's not the main way he approaches them. And so for faith, hope, and love, these 3 things or values or whatever you want to call them, Ellul says, what is the ethical dimension of these things? And so for faith, he thinks the ethical dimension is holiness. For hope, he thinks, in other words, when you have faith, what it means for your life is holiness.
Mm-hmm.
When you have hope, what it means for your life is freedom. You live freely. And then when you have love, well, for that one, he didn't really translate it. It was basically he planned an ethics of love or an ethics of relationship. So these 3 main parts of his work will be his ethics will be ethics of holiness, ethics of freedom, and ethics of love or ethics of relationship. Now, he started with the ethics of freedom because he thought that was the most urgent, especially in the technological age that he described. But he also felt it comes first in a sense. And I would suggest he models it off of Israel's experience in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, they're slaves in Egypt, and the first thing that happens when God speaks to them is they are freed. They become freed and they go out. So this freedom is the first foundational one. And then he moves to holiness, which to say in one word, it doesn't necessarily mean, like we often think of holiness and we hear like moral purity or perfection or something. And Ellul says, no. Holiness means set apart. And so this setting apart, this changing what you are, or setting apart for a different purpose, for a different reason, for a special service, that's the ethics of holiness. And then finally, the ethics of love. Well, to combine the 3, I suppose, and to translate it into somewhat sociological terms, ethics of freedom means that it breaks the bonds, the normal ways in which you relate sociologically to the others in your group are broken. So In other words, you no longer function according to the same sociological laws as everyone else in your group. So holiness then describes the constitution of a new, different kind of group that doesn't, and according to those original sociological laws. And then love describes the establishment of a new kind of relationship with your milieu or your original group or your social group that's very different from the original one. It's been transformed and still, but it isn't like you leave the social group and never come back, but you are broken from it, you are changed, and then you relate to it differently. So that's the kind of setup of these three things. So he starts with ethics of freedom, and it's massive. It's I forget if it's 1,000 pages or 2,000, but it comes out in 3 volumes in French, and there is an English version, but it's a bit of a mess compared to the French version. And then he writes 1,000-page manuscript for the Ethics of Holiness. And so if anyone is listening to this podcast and they're maybe a master's student who really likes Jacques Ellul and wants to do a PhD later, well, the Ethics of Holiness is a great spot for you to think of doing a new PhD because it just came out a few months ago, 30 years after Ellul's death. So at the moment, it's only in French. Maybe someday we'll get it translated. But so yeah, the Ethics of Holiness is this massive 900-page French book that just came out. And then finally, the Ethics of Love or Relationship. As far as we know, he never got around to writing. So it's this unfinished project. And then I mentioned the introduction. So the introduction is called To Will and To Do, and that exists in 2 volumes. So 2 volumes for the introduction, 3 volumes for Ethics of Freedom, 1 colossal volume for Ethics of Holiness. Altogether, if it was all translated into English and corresponded to the French corpus, it would be about 6 enormous books.
Yeah, no, that's a super helpful kind of overview of the project. Thank you. I'm wondering if you might just sort of maybe kind of further lay out sort of the contours of this project. I know there's a lot that could be said about obviously what you just described of a 6 volume project. But maybe wherever you kind of want to dive in. I know one thing that came up in your chapter a good bit that was sort of a at least one kind of thread through it was this idea that like ethics that's specifically Christian is holds this kind of tension between being impossible but also necessary, and that so Ellul's idea of sort of a Christian ethics sort of sits at the side of that tension. So I don't know if you want to speak on that, or if there's anything in particular that you want to sort of unravel about this Christian ethics project.
Sure. So I will speak on that. But before I do, just very briefly, I'll say that I think a good way to read it is to keep Kierkegaard in mind. So Kierkegaard, the goal of Kierkegaard's writing was to guide the reader to a life change as they progress through his corpus. I think it's important to read Ellul's ethics that way too. It's not, again, he's not just a systematician. He's not laying out an intellectual system. What he's doing is speaking to you and hoping that that speech is felt as an address, and that you respond not by writing more books, but by living differently. And so there's a kind of dialogue there. So yeah, I think just reading his stuff as a kind of compared to the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, something that leads you through a progression.
Sure.
But yeah, I'll talk briefly about the thing you mentioned. So at the end of the first volume of his introduction, To Will and To Do, Ellul talks about the end. There are 2 chapters: the impossibility of a Christian ethic, and then the necessity of a Christian ethic. And I think understanding that combination is a good way to set up his whole project. So why is Christian ethics impossible for Ellul? Well, because he's worried about ethics becoming morality. Now, he probably uses these terms in ways that not everyone else does. For him, morality, you might say, is sociological morality. Morality describes the ways in which a normal sociological group coheres. And so one of those ways that he developed in Will Institute Volume 1 is, is shared behavior. The shared behavior becomes the basis of group validity, a shared morality, a shared set of these are things we do, these are things we don't do. Now, what Ellul's worried about is Christian ethics becoming a new version of that, in which the church would be bound together primarily by a shared set of actions. What Ellul is insisting is that a theology of grace, especially a theology of justification in Christ alone, means that what binds us together can never be reduced to a set of moral principles or do's and don'ts or laws. It has to be this God that we all believe in, that is so difficult to define or pin down, who's there, who is real and alive, and who works in and through all of us. And so that makes it so much more complicated and so much less of a cohesive foundation for group unity. And so basically his concern is that the church not just be one more sociological group. And so that's the impossibility of it. He says, if you were to construct this Christian ethic, how could it possibly avoid that? How would it be not just more sociology? And then why then does he think it's necessary? Well, for him, precisely because he thinks every group, more or less unconsciously, secretes a morality. In other words, if you don't intellectually construct it as a sort of relative thing, well, then the group will unconsciously create it as this thing that binds them together. And then they will exclude the one who doesn't behave like the group and function just like any other sociological group. And so, kind of ironically or paradoxically, the necessity of Christian morality is precisely to maintain its relative status as this sort of humble thing that guides the group, but doesn't become a judging criteria by which to exclude or destroy anyone who doesn't quite fit it. So basically what that does is it sets up all of his ethical project as this thing that is a humble, relative attempt to describe a Christian life that he thinks is necessary and hopes to be a helpful tool, and never claim to be this absolute science that allows us to draw the line between black and white, between who's in and who's out.
Right. Yeah, right. So would you say that he would be, that he was, or he would be critical of sort of like natural theology, or like a more of a natural law ethics approach?
Yes. In fact, the subtitle of the French version of To Will and To Do, his introduction, is Critique of Natural Theology. And so there is a big chapter in volume 1, or a big section in which he kind of rails against the presence of natural law in Christian theology, which he sees as an importation from Greek thinking that he writes elsewhere, launches the church, he says, on several thousand years of theological errors and problems. So yeah, he is very, very critical of that. Though later in his work, he allows for a kind of natural theology, but yeah, he thinks that having natural theology play such a central role in, or natural law especially plays such a central role in Christian theology is problematic.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to turn to his sociological work now, and we won't unfortunately have as much time to talk about sort of that side of his work. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about technique, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. So maybe kind of turning to his book, The Technological Society, which I'm not sure, but from my sense, maybe his most famous or most popular work, at least in English translation. So here he's kind of writing in depth about what he calls technique, right, and some of the problems he sees with technique in the modern world. So what would you say Ellul sort of means when he uses this word technique? And then why does he see it as so problematic and so sort of pervasive, particularly in the modern world?
Yeah. So what he means by technique, I guess if you had to sum it up, it's like we often mistranslate it as technology. So we think Ellul's writing about machines and computers and all that stuff. And he is, but that's not what he means by technique. What he means by technique is more the mindset or kind of logic of thinking. It's the what created this stuff. What is the way of thinking that led us to the smartphone? And so I guess one short definition he gives is technique is a rational drive towards ordered efficiency. Another way to say it is it's the search for the one best way of doing things. Now, in its own sphere, that sort of thinking is fine. In other words, if you're building a machine, you do want to ask what is the most efficient way to build this machine? What's the best way to have all these things put together to accomplish the purpose that we're trying to accomplish? Um, the trouble is when you start applying that logic to things like your spiritual life or your family life or your sexual life or the way you approach animals or food. In other words, approaching everything in that way means that everything takes on a sort of machine-like quality or a kind of mechanical way of relating to one another. So one way to illustrate the way that that's different from other ways of thinking is Ellul cites a famous French doctor, Huémoz, who says, I, I, I bandaged the patient, God cured him, or God healed him. And Ellul says, you cannot say, I stepped on the accelerator and God made the car go forward. The whole conception of what happens in those two processes is totally different. They're processes that exist within different universes. And so he's trying to highlight that radical change. And so that's a bit about technique. And again, remember, if technique is naming driving force of the modern world, well, it means that all of human life is being filtered through that search for efficiency, that sort of mechanical way of relating. And things like mystery get lost, things like things like valuing free time, basically anything that isn't useful, anything that doesn't function gets seen as being less valuable or less important. But what Ellul's trying to highlight is so much of human life is made up of things that do not have any use value or any function. And so we lose a lot when that happens. So that's some of why it's so problematic. And again, it often, if he's calling us a technological society in his look of that title, well, what he's saying is our human group relation is less human and more technological. He's again describing the link between the individual and the society or the group as technological or as a thing. Now, I will just take 1 second here to give the interested listener a few things to whet their appetite to maybe dive into the technological society. So it was translated into English because the American publisher asked Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, to recommend some European treatments on the question of technology, which would be worth translating. And Huxley basically said, well, the best one is Ellul's Technological Society. It does what I tried to do in Brave New World, but way better. So
Wow.
there you go. There's an appetizer. And then the other interesting factoid about this book, its most infamous reader was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
who was utterly gripped and convinced by Ellul's argument, but somewhere along the way decided to mail bombs to people, at which point Ellul would have said, I'm sorry, I think you misunderstood the point,
Yeah,
or maybe
yeah.
you should have read my theology as well.
Right, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I'd forgotten about the Kaczynski connection. So, yeah, I guess I'm wondering is technique sort of a cipher for modernity for Ellul? Like, is there um, is what he means by technique sort of this is there something anti-modern about it, or sort of anti like modern modes of existence, or something like that?
So I would say that technique is certainly a product of modernity for Ellul, but it also names the ways in which modernity gets lost in its own creation.
Hmm.
Um, so, in other words, the thinking that gave rise to technique is no longer the driving force by the mid 20th century in Ellul's thinking. Um, he sees it as pretty much enslaved to the things it's created. As far as the question of is there something anti-modern going on here, in a way, yes, or at least para-modern. He's not, so Ellul definitely isn't trying to reestablish the modern project. And yet, what I find, one of the things I find so very interesting about him is he doesn't quite correspond to postmoderns either. He's not, he's living contemporaries. He's living in the same time as Derrida and Michel Foucault and all these other guys, but he's not
Hmm.
doing the same thing as them either.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Last question has to do with sort of his continuing popularity. Like, how do you? Obviously, his work is so powerful and incisive and germane to sort of the technological just sort of overhaul, I guess, that we've had in the last several decades. But like, how do you sort of account for the fact that he's still his work is still so compelling and so relevant even today, or maybe even especially today, over 30 years after his death?
Hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple ways I could answer. I think one is the fact that he's trying to talk to you. His work doesn't fit into most categories that we want to put it into, and that communicative aspect of it is a big reason. So in Presence in the Modern World, he has a really nice line where he says something like, "There has never been so much said about man or about humanity, and yet there has never been so little said to man or humanity." So in
Mm-hmm.
other words, he's naming already in 1948 the fact that the average person feels like they're just at the mercy of these forces and they don't have a say. They're not a member of the dialogue. And so what Ellul's work does is it speaks to you in order to get you to speak back. And that rhetorical force that it has sets it apart from so much other uh, either sociology or theology. And so that does lead to, I think, its prophetic aspect and prophetic element. So that's one thing. But the second, I think, um, is he raises the question. Is he kind of poses the question to us today, some 70 years later? Is technique still the driving thing? Is that what's guiding us? And I guess the corollary question that he raises is, are you really free? And if you think you are, fine, but he's going to still make you work to hold on to your answer if you keep reading his stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so his challenging what you think freedom is, what we think freedom means, and what we think it means to say that we are free makes his work of enduring value. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is those who have asked that question, heard that questioning, some of them have thought, yeah. So in 2012, there was a French journalist who was not a Christian, who only read one of Ellul's books, but it shocked him so much that he wrote his own book called Jacques Ellul, the Man Who Predicted Almost Everything. And so he read a book written in the 80s and that explained the last 30 years of social development. So I would say those are the things that I find most compelling about it. Number one, the prophetic side. Number two, the communicative side, and number three, just that yeah, he actually did produce a lot, and like his work gives you an interpretive framework for addressing so many things today, for fitting so much of what happens today within.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so one thing I like to do, kind of as I bring all episodes to a close, is just give our guests a chance to share any works they have in progress or anything that you might want to plug. So, is there anything in that vein that you'd like to share about here? I know you said you're really working on Elul, and that's sort of your world. But is there anything you'd like to share here as we kind of come to a close?
Yes. So number one is the International Jacques Ellul Society. So if you're listening to this and you think, oh man, this sounds great, where can I find more? Google us, the IJES. We can join the society. We have a publication called the Ellul Forum where people talk about this stuff, and it's intentionally para-academic. There is stuff in there that is an academic journal format, but there's also artists who write stuff, or anyone can write in it. And I guess what it really is a conversation. So if you want to
Yeah.
join that conversation about Ellul, please do. And going along with that, we're planning our next conference. We have conferences every 2 years. This past year, we were in Chicago at Roosevelt University. And so we're planning for July 2026 at Notre Dame. And the theme of the conference will be on Ellul's book, The Humiliation of the Word. So it's about the word. What is the word? What does the word mean? What does it mean today? And I highly encourage anyone who's interested to look into those things. And then finally, very briefly, yes, I have one last thing in progress at the moment, and it's a collection of articles, articles that were published in the 60s through 80s in a review called Gete, Be Reconciled, which was published in the South, in the American South. And it involves a lot of really interesting figures like Walker Percy, um, Thomas Merton had some in there. What really was the engine that drove this thing was Jacques Ellul. And so it's interesting to look into his reception in the South at a time when society was so divided. And they choose the title of a magazine called Be Reconciled, and then they let Ellul drive the ship in a way. So that's the project that we've got going on now. So that hopefully will be coming out from Open Stock in the next year or so if it goes well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that sounds fascinating. Well, Jake, thank you so much for taking the time today. It was really fun reading your book and learning about Jacques Ellul. For listeners, again, the book is by Jacob Marques-Rollison and Jacob Van Vliet. It's titled Jacques Ellul, A Companion to His Major Works. I'll leave a link in the show notes to that and to all the things you just plugged and mentioned there. Be sure to click the link for that book and get a copy. It's slim and affordable and well worth your time. So, Jake, thank you again so much for coming on today.
Thanks very much, Zach. It's been a pleasure.